Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 2020 Charter Review Committee, July 6, 2020 meeting. As we normally do, let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. Mrs. Kresser, could you call the roll, please?
Mr. Berquist,
Present.
Ms. Castillo,
Here.
Mrs. Corso, Mrs. Guerra,
Here.
Mr. Jones,
Here.
Mr. Kresser,
Here.
Mr. Lamarca,
Present.
Mr. Mack,
Here.
Mr. Meredith,
Here.
Mr. Milkey,
Here.
Ms. Murray,
Here.
Ms. Sortino,
Here.
Mr. Whalen,
Here.
Mrs. Andel.
Here.
Okay, thank you. Next item on the business, on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the June 17, 2020 meeting. The minutes were submitted or circulated in advance of tonight's meeting. First, are there any questions or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion and a second.
Mr. Chairman, I recommend we accept the minutes of the July 17th meeting.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion and second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay, those will be passed as submitted. Thank you. Next item is,
This is Kima. I need to abstain. I wasn't there.
what's that?
I need to abstain. I wasn't at the meeting.
Okay, we'll note that for the record. Thank you. Next item is audience participation. Mrs. Kresser, were there any submittals that need to be read into the record tonight?
No, Mr. Chairman, there were not.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, that takes us to current business. And so just to kind of go back, what we're here tonight, we have sorted through every provision in the charter, and then we sorted them into two buckets for right now, which is sections that are not recommended for a change and sections where there are recommended changes. And so what I thought we'd do tonight is before we jump into those is first to ask the question of the committee is if everyone, I want to just have an open discussion, have we provided everyone with a sufficient amount of information to be able to make a decision on the charter provisions that we would recommend? And have we had sufficient public input, and have we had sufficient input from staff and outside experts? And I'll just stop there and ask for any comments from the committee if there's a need for additional information or if we feel like that we've gotten enough information. So I'll open it to the floor. Any comments?
I'd chime in and say, this is Mr. Jones for the record. I'd chime in and say I think that we've discussed and gone over this and had the experts. I think we're in a good place to move forward with what our purpose is.
Okay, thank you.
We've reviewed.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions on that issue? All right. Otherwise, we'll consider that we've let the record reflect that we've discussed it and that we have sufficient information and input from the community. And so then that will take us to item 5A. And item 5A are the listing of the sections that are not recommended for a change. And those were circulated in advance of the meeting so that everyone would have an opportunity to look those over and to make sure that that list accurately reflects where the committee came out, that these were, each of these provisions which are on the agenda and are being put up on the screen right now are sections of the charter for which there's no need for further discussion because there's the committee has determined that that would not recommend any changes to these provisions. So I'll pause there and ask for comments or questions or additions or any provisions that anyone wants to raise that should be pulled off that list and put into consideration. Okay, so to be clarified, are there any provisions on that list that anyone thinks should be removed?
No.
Are there any additional provisions that should be added to this list that we're not going to, that we don't want to consider? Okay, hearing none, then I would entertain a motion to approve the charter provisions concluded in 5A to affirm that they are sections that are not recommended for a change.
Mr. Chairman, I'd make that motion to accept that list not recommended for change.
Okay, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on the motion?
Mr. Chairman, for the record, can you identify who made the motion and second since I cannot see them?
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Mr. Meredith made the motion and Mr. Jones seconded it.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I think we would need a roll call vote on this. Ms. Presser, could you call the roll?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes.
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milkey,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel.
Yes.
Okay, that motion is passed unanimously. Okay, that takes us to then to section B, 5B, and these are the sections that we set aside to be recommended for additional discussion and potential for recommendation of the City Commission to put on the ballot for a change. And so I thought what we would do is we'll just go each section by section and see what the discussion is, and then we can make a decision if we want to change them and if so, what changes we would recommend. So the first item under that would be section 1B, which is gender. And this is fairly short. All references to gender in this charter shall designate both sexes, and wherever the male gender is used, it shall be deemed to include both male and female counterparts. Mrs. Cresser provided us all with the minutes of what our prior discussion was on that as a refresher. Hopefully everyone's got a chance to read that. And so I won't regurgitate that here, but I will assume that everybody has read that. And I'll open the floor to discussion on that provision. Again, section 1B, gender.
I believe we were going to leave that as is, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, yes, I think we did have the discussion. The minutes reflected that the methodology that we had used in the charter was pretty much consistent with how others have handled it. And so that issue is before the group to decide is that have we adequately handled this with the current language that's in the charter such that we wouldn't need to entertain any further changes. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Hearing none, I would need a motion then to close out. I suppose the motion would be that section 1B gender would no changes would be recommended, that the current language would remain as is.
So moved.
Okay, I have a motion from Mr. Whalen.
Second.
Second from
I'll
Mr.
second
Meredith.
that.
Excuse me?
I was seconding it, but that's okay. We're good.
Okay, all right, sorry about that. Okay, all right, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, can you call the roll, please?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes.
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandell.
Yes.
Okay, that motion is passed unanimously. Next would be Section 2, Form of Government. And this is the charter provision that sets forth that the city will run under a commission manager plan consisting of 7 city commissioners who are citizens and elected at large as opposed to an award system. And that we're governed, we have a chief appointed administrative officer known as the city manager. And so on this one, we had Professor Nichols come in and provide us some additional information. We had a couple of good discussions about this. And so we said that we would come back tonight and we would discuss this. And so I'll open the floor to discuss this issue, the form, Section 2 of the Charter Form of Government.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Tom Lamarca. I had brought up the ward issue in the past, and I think that's why it's still on the agenda. I've not received any more feedback from many other folks within the community, but I think COVID may have had something to do with that. I think there's still folks out there that would like to see the ward system brought back into the fold of Sandusky. And I know that I'm the minority in this, but that's my comment.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, of all the comments I got, that was the number one issue that we could address. A lot of other stuff come up that I said that was out of the realm of charter review, but they also feel that they would like to go back to the 4 wards which were already designed and in place, and then 3, at large.
Okay. Others, to please weigh in. We need this to be a discussion and back and forth a little bit so that we get all the perspectives out on the table.
I would say the good part, I think the reason people would want a ward is to get a little bit more responsiveness from government towards their particular, and I do think that that's valid. I know people that have had issues where, they don't necessarily think a commissioner speaks for them. But I think that there's a lot of drawbacks too. I know that cities that have wards end up fighting for their ward over what's best for the city, and really the city's small enough that what's good for some should be good for all, because it's really not that big a city. So I guess the idea of 4 wards and 3 at large is not the worst idea in the world, but I don't know that we're at a place where we need it, is my opinion.
Okay. Others that would like to weigh in on this issue?
This is Mr. Jones. I'm very torn about it, actually, believe it or not. I kind of came into this thinking that I would be very much a fan of keeping things the way they are. And there's something about the idea of drawing up lines to let certain parts of the city have a designated voice that appeals to me as I think about the current layout of the commission as it is right now, where I think it's very centered to a certain end of town. So I don't know. I'm very, very torn about it. I haven't made up my mind yet. If this came down to vote, what I'd do. That doesn't answer anything. That's just my.
No, that's fair. I mean, that helps the conversation. It does. It does. We want to make sure that, this is, as Mr. Berquist points out, this is something that has garnered some attention. And so just want to make sure that that we have a discussion on it that informs each other what we're thinking about, so everybody has the benefit of the other committee members' thoughts and what they bring to from the community, so that if there's a motion and we take a vote on it, we've done that after having had a discussion. So others who would like to weigh in?
This is Kima, and I've asked all of the neighbors around me and anywhere I'm out and about, which during COVID has been a little less than normal. I have not one person that would choose to do the ward system that I've asked.
Okay. Thank you for that.
This is Drew Meredith, and I've had similar conversations with folks where I work and around the community, and they feel right now the current government that we have in place and how we operate meets the needs of the community at this time.
This is Jade Castile. I just want to say I agree. I don't think the ward system is best suited for this city just because of our population size. I know it was mentioned in the past, we were talking about Cleveland as a model, and each of their wards had like 25,000 people in it. That's our entire population almost. So I agree. I would like to stick with the current form of government.
Okay.
But to add to that, I do agree with Alex. I do see some appeal in that we might get some representation for some communities that are maybe underrepresented currently. But on the same wavelength, we could also have commissioners focusing only on their ward and not the bigger picture, the broader picture of the entire city. So I would vote today yes to keep the current form, but I do see the appeal in the ward system.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Kurt Kresser. I haven't had too many people respond to this whatsoever for whatever reasons or not. I mean, I do kind of like the idea of having representation from each section of the community. I mean, that does not sound like a bad thing. But with the size of our community, I don't feel we're large enough for that. And from my understanding is, you know, we try to build one section of the community, which at this point in time is the business district in downtown, to generate the funds to help feed the rest of the community. And I think that's something that's being done. I think that is something that maybe should be expressed a little bit more to the community on the process of how we're going about this to reach the community and some of the different neighborhoods. I like the idea of the Talon Floor going out there and doing that, but because of the current situation, we lost him. I thought that was an awesome asset to the city as far as I was concerned. But nobody I talked to really seems to have that strong, adamant, yes, we need to go ahead and change this form of government because I'm being left out and that type of thing. Everybody in every community is going to feel like they their needs aren't being met, their section of the community is not going to be taken care of. I mean, this is not a unique issue whatsoever to our community. I think the process and how our government's working at this point is something that's working for us, and basically that's due to the size. And I just think it needs to be communicated a little bit more, the idea and what we are doing and how we're going to create the income to reach out to the rest of the community. I know it was brought up in our discussions that you know, it seems like the majority or the population of our commissioners are all centered in one area. You know, I don't know why that is or isn't, but it is what it is. I mean, it would be nice to be able to get people from the west side and further east and the south side and things of that nature to run. But for whatever reason, that just isn't the case. And I'm not sure if creating a ward system is going to create anybody from the west side or the south side or the east side to run anyway. You know, I mean, you have to have an interest in your government. You have to have, you know, a genuine concern about what's going on. So I guess I'm comfortable with, at this point in time, leaving it the way it is and moving on from there with maybe a better, getting the information out a little bit better. As far as, this is what we're doing to try to generate the income to try to build our neighborhoods. Because if we don't have this, the rest of the city's going to fall apart. So that's kind of my take on it.
Thank you for that, appreciate it. Others that have comments on this issue, the Section 2 form of government?
This is Adriana, and I had kind of a question or statement. I agree with what everybody said, but no one has brought up the point of the commission consisting of 7 citizens. I know we talked about, I think Eric might have explained the benefit of having 7 versus 5 or 6, but I didn't know if that was still on the table or something that should be up for discussion.
Yes, I mean, all of the above are on the table. Just as a process point, we'll have a discussion and then we'll entertain motions. For example, if someone wants us to consider that we change it to a ward system, as Mr. Berquist, laid out 4 and 3, then we make a motion, we'd all vote on that. If it got 8 votes, then that would move forward. If you were to make a motion and say, hey, we want to take the commission from 7 to 5, and someone seconded and we got 8 votes, we would make that change. So that is very much still out there to be discussed.
Okay. And I'm not ready to make a motion. I don't have any research or statistics behind this, and I wasn't sure if we've done any research on how cities of our size, how many commissioners they have, just from like a cost saving perspective, or could we increase the salary of some of those commissioners to, if we cut a few? I'm not quite sure how all of that works.
I think we did have some information on that early on, especially on the salaries. And then, as we said, we had Professor Nichols come in about just the government system in general. I don't recall her getting specifically into the number. But I do think in one of the earlier meetings when we were going over salary, we discussed the size a little bit of that. And if my recollection serves, we kind of talked about 9. We went up as high as 9, and I think it was a general consensus of the group that seemed like too many. And then we talked about 5 and the implications of that in terms of voting blocks and versus this county commission at 3 and what the voting does. So we kind of talked generally about the dynamics of that, the group think, if you will, and how that works. And so that was kind of, I think that's a fair recitation of what we talked about, but I don't know that I can recall us getting any particular statistics about other communities and their size, but others can weigh in if they recall differently.
Yeah, there was a discussion, but I don't think we ever brought up changing it from the current 7, making it 4 wards, which the city of Sandusky already is divided in 4 wards, and then 3 at large, but not really altering that number of 7.
Yeah. The issue was brought up, and I think we discussed it as that, but you're right, we didn't. And I mean, that doesn't foreclose the issue. And so we can take that issue up in due course. If there's a motion in a second, we can take that up. So, anything else?
This is Kima. Yeah, it's Kima. The 7 allows for an easy quorum. The more we get, the more people you have to have for a quorum for any decision. So that is something, and I do believe someone in the city stated that 7 was an easy way to deal with that.
Yep, it definitely has that impact. Okay, thank you. Other comments?
My only comment on that subject matter is I've always liked the idea of 5 commissioners and a larger salary. I think you put a larger salary out there, you're going to get a bigger pool of people that are going to run and it'd make it worth their time. I mean, $100 a week, who does anything for $100 a week, but I've always liked that 5. I almost think 7's too much. 3's certainly not enough, but 5 and a nice salary is something that I think could draw some people.
Well, my problem with 5 is you only need 3 small commissioners that are pretty much going to run the whole city.
Mm-hmm.
And we already have that, 3 small commissioners that could, when you drop that pool down, you really are limiting the input from a lot of other people, and you can control a board much easier with a limited number.
That's true.
Tom Lamarca, Mr. Chairman, I agree with Mr. Berkowitz. We seem to already have a block formed within the commission, in my opinion, that kind of prevents some legislation from getting passed. So 7 is the number, and I don't know that we're talking about salaries yet, Mr. Cresser, because that's later on the agenda.
2 more, yep.
But be that as it may, I think that the ward system has some merit. I believe, though, that it's going to take a grassroots efforts by the citizens of Sandusky to get a little bit more behind it and push the effort for the next charter review. I just think maybe we're tweaking it maybe just a little bit too soon. Many folks, and the information is not getting out there because the citizens still believe everything's getting dumped downtown for just downtown. They're seeing no benefit of the dollars being spread across the city. And that's the commissioner's job to take care of that right now. And again, in my opinion, $20 million in one section of town, and it's not generating the dollars for the citizens for the most part.
Okay. Any other comments? I guess I would offer to comment, I think that as I listen to what we said, having 7 commissioners when you don't have a ward system allows for that more broad perspective across the city. And so I think that's why I would keep that number to do that. And also, Mr. Berkowitz, I think your point of the voting block is really, really important. It's harder to get 4 people in the book than 3 and so on. And the other thing I think is the ward system and the kind of the interest in the potentially in the ward system is really something we all talked about before is, do you have a responsive government, right? And so that is the key. That's a mechanism. The ward system's a mechanism to get a responsive government. We do have open city commission meetings, and we have had a lot more public outreach, I think, on a lot of the projects over the last 4 or 5 years, and there's been a lot of public debate about that, so I think that's a good thing. And hopefully, and the commissioners got to listen to it, right? And they have to kind of understand what their charge is, but that's another kind of political issue. So it seems like having 7 and keeping it all at large kind of is a responsive form of government, at least for the moment. And as our community grows and develops, that could change, to your point, Mr. Lamarca, and others. And we'll see, right? If it remains responsive, open, and people have the ability to give input and the commissioners are responsive, then maybe this form will remain. And if not, then maybe it would change. So with that in mind, we've now had the discussion, and so to move past this, we would need, a motion. Either, like I said, there's a variety of motions that can be made. The motion to adopt a ward system, as Mr. Berkowitz has laid out, a motion to change the number of commissioners, a motion to leave it alone, to keep the form of government as it currently is and recommend no changes. But we would need a motion and a second. Then we can have further discussion on that, and we can vote on this issue so that we can see where we're at. So I would open the floor to anyone who wants to make a motion for the consideration of the group.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we leave the form of government as is.
Okay, Mr. Meredith has made a motion. Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, this is Jade Castillo. I'll second that motion.
Okay, we have a second. Ms. Castillo?
Yes, Castillo.
And so we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on this? The motion is to not change Section 2 of the charter, which is the city manager form of government with 7 at-large commissioners. Any further comments or questions? Okay, hearing none. Mrs. Cresser, can you call the roll?
Mr. Berkowitz?
No.
Mrs. Castillo?
I'm sorry, the motion, could you repeat the motion?
Okay, the motion, if you vote yes, you're voting to leave the provision as is.
Okay, yes. I vote yes to leave it.
Okay?
Sorry, he threw me.
No,
with
that's fine.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
No.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Melky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sartino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel.
Yes.
Okay, that motion having received more than the requisite number of 8 votes would be deemed passed, and the committee has determined that Section 2, the form of government, will not be recommended for a change from this Charter Review Committee. Next is qualifications, and this is related to to become a member of the City Commission, and there was a good discussion about the number of years one had to be a citizen prior to their election. It's currently at 3 years. We had a discussion whether or not that should be shortened to 18 months or 2 years. And that was kind of the primary overlay of what we had discussed. There was also some discussion about a moral turpitude type of clause for qualifications that we discussed as well, just for completeness of the record. And so with that in mind, I would open the floor up to comments on Section 4 qualifications.
Mr. Chairman, Tom Lamarca.
Yes.
At the previous meetings and under much discussion, I think the general consensus was that 2 years would be an acceptable term of residency, and so I would make a motion for that to
Okay.
be the change.
We have a motion for Mr. Lamarca that we change the qualifications for residency from 3 years to 2 years. Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, I second that. Jeff Berquist.
Okay, Jeff Berquist seconds the motion. Okay, is there any more discussion on this issue? Comments?
This is one thing that I did have that people showed me of just talking to a younger crowd. They felt like a year or 18 months, they've gone down to a year being a resident, that it would be, you put your time in, so to speak, and maybe 18 months. So, I'm not opposed to the 2 years, but from the conversations I had with the younger crowd, they were like, yeah, a year. I mean, I think if we're committed to our community, I think after a year, we should be able to run for commissioner. So,
Okay.
and I wouldn't be opposed to splitting the difference, 18 months, and
Okay.
I'm not opposed to the 2 years either.
Other comments? We'll come back to that. Other comments? Does that spur any other
This
comments?
is Kima, and I'm 18 months, always have been. I'm a new resident in the city, and I feel like I follow a lot of things, and 18 months is fair for that.
Okay. Other comments?
Mr. Chairman, this is Jade Castile. I originally also said 18 months, just with my own experience from moving away for 6 years and coming back. However, I would be okay with 2 years as well, if that's the more general consensus.
Okay. Thank you. Others?
Mr. Chair, this is David Mack. I would also be in favor of looking at a shorter term, either the 12 months or willing to split the difference at 18.
Okay, thank you. Other comments?
Mr. Chairman, this is more of a statement or kind of a question. It appears that everybody seems to agree that we should take it down from 3 years. I think we're having more debate on whether we're going to go with 18 months or 2 years. So maybe we could throw that out there just to kind of maybe vote on that. Can we do that first?
So we can vote on that if we want to. We have a motion for 2 years. We can either vote on that, or we can, if somebody wants to make a motion to amend the motion to 18 months, then we can put that on the table. But I think first, let's hear everybody and kind of get a feel for that, whether or not that's
Mr. Chairman, Drew Meredith, I've had similar conversations, and everything I'm hearing too is a year to 18 months. I don't think anyone's opposed to two, but they just feel 18 months seems to be that sweet spot for knowing what's going on in the community, et cetera.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, this is Mr. Jones. I don't really have strong feelings between the two, 18 months or 2 years, so I think that either one is acceptable. Whatever the committee decides to do, let's rock and roll with it.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, do we have a motion to amend? Does anybody want to amend the motion?
Mr. Chairman, I will amend that motion to 18 months.
Okay, is there a second to amend it?
Jade Castile, second.
Okay, there's a second to amend it. Okay, I'll open it back up for further discussion on that. Do we have those who had made the initial motion for 2 years want to weigh in and kind of give us your perspective?
Well, 18 months, in my opinion, is still too short term. 2 years is the mark. So that's just my opinion.
Okay.
Besides that, I mean, 18 months, it's just an odd number. Someone just threw that out there, 18 months. What has an 18-month requirement of any type?
A lot of people buy homes in the spring, about 6 months before an election.
Okay.
I just made that up. I'm not.
I was like, okay.
We could ask that question of Mr. Berquist because he's still active.
I'll defer to the expert.
But
I was in favor of the 2 years, but I'm not opposed to 18 months because depending on when your 18-month residency hits, it could be 2+ years before you actually could run on anything.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point with because I kind of agree with the 18 months seems a little odd, but when I think about it from what Mr. Berquist just said, a lot of times the practical reality will be 2 years. And so I look at it, 18 months means it's a definite 2 years, but it won't be 2.5. And that's kind of what persuades me that 18 months might be the right place to dial in. I think that's a really good point. Anybody else want to weigh in? Okay, if not, we have a motion and a second to change this, amend the original motion of 2 years to amend it to 18 months. And so what we would be voting on is to change section 4 of the charter qualifications from requiring 3 years of residency to requiring 18 months of residency immediately before running for office. Okay, Mrs. Cresser, will you call the roll, please?
Hold on, Mr. Chairman, real quick before, are we voting whether to amend?
Yeah, we first to amend.
We're first voting whether or not to amend. So if you prefer 2 years, you say no to this and you wait.
Correct.
Yes for the
You got
18
it.
months. Okay.
Mrs. Cresser, on the amendment?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes.
Ms. Castile,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
yes,
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay, now on the amended motion, to modify section 4 qualifications from 3 years to 18 months. Please call the roll.
Mr. Berquist,
Yes.
Ms. Castile,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
no,
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay, that motion passed. Thank you. Okay, next up is salary and commission salary. And,
I'd like to make a point, Mr. Chairman, before we move on. There
Yep.
was some discussion, just as I read in the minutes that were sent out prior, about looking at disqualifications, I guess. I don't know if we want to have more discussion. I don't know that I have anything to add, but it was mentioned at a prior date about things that would disqualify, not just the residency piece of it. So I
Sure.
know that we talked about possible, if you have a felony.
yeah, the moral turpitude, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you for
And
that.
again, I
No,
don't know that I
that's-
have anything to add to the conversation, but I don't want to skip over it if there is somebody who does.
Yeah, so why don't we, thank you for that. I'll open the floor up for comments on that, the moral turpitude or felony or disqualifying characteristics or circumstances that would disqualify you to run. Is there do we want to have a discussion on if we want to add that as part of the qualifications within the disqualifications? Or any comments on that?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's a slippery slope. You know, because even with the Division of Real Estate, Tom Mark can admit that because he was a real estate broker, there is a clause in there that we can have our license suspended for moral turpitude. But it is very gray language on that. And this is a Division of Real Estate that has some of the strictest guidelines. They keep your license in that. I think under a normal election, if there was a moral turpitude issue, who's ever running against that person or running against those people would bring that out in the light of day and not something that we can govern. I remember in one psych class I took, norm was what the majority of the people, population agrees on at any given time in the circulation. What is it today? What might it be tomorrow? What was it 2 years ago?
Right.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree with Mr. Berquist's statements and say that I would hope that the voting process would kind of eliminate those disqualified. I don't see a purpose in disqualifying somebody from being able to run. If they have moral, ethical issues, I would hope that the voting people would vote them out, and we have a procedure for being able to remove, so I don't think it's necessary.
Okay. Others that want to weigh in on this?
Mr. Chairman, this is Jade. I don't know if it's necessary, but I agree with the last two gentlemen. I don't think it's necessarily the government's place to have to decide what's morally one way or another. Hopefully, the constituents of the city will make the right choice. And if they didn't, I think that's what our democracy represents. The majority wins, and I like to keep it that way. And I think it's a slippery slope getting into felonies and that too, because I personally am very against branding people who have made mistakes with felonies, and then for the rest of their life, they're branded and they're unable to run for public office or do certain things. I absolutely will not get behind that, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, if we had that in a federal level, we'd have a lot less politicians.
Yeah.
There'd be nobody left.
That's an argument for.
So is there any other comments? I would agree with, I also agree with what everybody said in terms of we have the process, the political process can work these things out. We have a way to recall, and things change over time. And so I would just ask, does anyone want to make a motion to put the disqualifier language in there? And in the absence of a motion, we'll move on to the next section. So I'll pause here. Okay. We will not entertain that then. Thank you for raising that so that we make sure that is a good point. I encourage others to do that. I want, when the process is over, everybody feels like we did cover everything and everybody got an opportunity to speak their piece and we were thorough. So, okay, that takes us to salaries and bonds for the city commissioners. And right now, the city commissioners are paid $100 a week. And the president receives an extra $20 per week. And we had a discussion on that before, and the idea of indexing that to the PERS, Public Employee Retirement System threshold for be able to receive retirement benefits was discussed at some length as I look back through the notes from the last meeting. And so that kind of, I think, just sets it up. Generally, I'll open the floor for discussion on the issue of salary and bonds.
Mr. Chairman, Connor Whalen, I would say that I like the idea of tying it to the retirement system, and I would go a little further and say that I really don't want to see us putting it a whole lot ahead of that. I think right around there is a good way. I know more money would motivate more to do it, but I don't necessarily think that's the people I want running for commission. I want people that want to be a part of the city government and do it out of a sense of duty than the pay. So I think retirement amount and setting it to that, it would be the way I would like to see it go.
Okay, thank you. Others, comments on this provision?
I also
Mr. Chairman.
agree. Mr. Chairman, I also agree with this. I can't believe that it's gone through doing math in my head, 4 other charter reviews, and this thing hasn't been changed since 98. I don't think a lot of people run for the money, but at least bringing it up to somewhat of a normal level would at least indicate that we appreciate what they do and the time they give. And it's not the couple hours meetings, that they have here. It's the time that's put on after the meetings, before the meeting, liaisons, in my case, with fair housing and civil rights. I always have the city commissioner there. And those are half-hour meetings that they also are donating their time to.
Yeah, it's a tough job, no doubt.
Mr. Chairman, Jade Castile, I agree with everybody. I'd like to see it tied to the PRS system as well. But off of what Connor said, I agree that we don't want, I personally wouldn't want people motivated monetarily, but I also can respect that it might actually open up for a larger pool of candidates who, it's a time commitment, and people have sometimes 2 jobs. Not everybody can afford to work and just do this as a hobby. Some people would need to supplement that time that they're missing from another job to be able to participate. So I think it's important to raise it, but not too much.
Okay, thank you. Mr. LaMarca, I'm sorry.
That's quite all right, Mr. Chairman. I concur with Mr. Berkwitz's statements. The amount of time invested by a commissioner and Mr. Whalen, I agree. And if we tie it to the OPES, that it gives them a little incentive, a little benefit for all the efforts that they put into the job. I don't believe that folks that run for the commission are running for the money. I mean, it's just not a high-paying position. If we were talking county commissioner now, that'd be different.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Other comments? So one thing I think Mr. Haberger told us that threshold is $8,076.90 right now to be eligible for PERS, just to give that a little further context. So it would go from 5,000 to 8,000 roughly. So any other comments? What I've kind of heard us say is that what the amendment we would recommend here would be to index the salaries for city commissioners to the Ohio PERS minimum to allow for participation in the PERS retirement system. And so if that is the case and there's no further discussion, we would need a motion and a second in order to entertain that change. We're recommending that change.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to make that motion.
Okay, I have a motion for Mr. Whalen. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, motion or second from Mr. Jones. Is there any questions, comments, or further discussion?
The only question that I have, we're talking about just the indexing. We're not putting a dollar amount in there, right? So theoretically, we'll never have to come and revisit salaries.
Right. There would be an initial raise, and then every time that went up, it would automatically raise the.
Right. we don't have to take action in the future for them to get that raised to stay at that threshold.
Right.
That's what we're
That-
saying.
yes.
Okay.
Yes. Does that generate any questions or comments? Okay, hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, can you call the roll?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes.
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Melky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That motion is passed. Okay, the next section is section 13 and section 14. I think they're kind of get together. They're about ordinance enactment. I think we also, when we discussed this before, we slipped section 25 expenditures in there. But in order to kind of keep the record clean, I would like to just see on section 13, which is the process for enacting an ordinance and the number of readings and the 30-day waiting period to have it officially enacted. And then section 14 is the emergency provisions that allow the city to say under given certain defined circumstances to waive those requirements and have immediate effective ordinances. And so I don't want to conflate those with section 25. So if we're looking at section 13 and section 14, basically the process for ordinance enactment, if I look through our notes, I wanted to ask the group, is there change that people are recommending on those two provisions? And then we'll handle section 25 later with the thresholds. But on the ordinance enactment, the 2 readings in 30 days and the emergency provision that allows the avoidance of that, is there any discussion or move from anyone that thinks we ought to revisit that and recommend any kind of changes there? And I guess the commission will often use the emergency provision to kind of help get the legislation moving. So just, that's one thing that I've heard other people mention, that the city does that. And so just to get all the public commentary out on the table, that's one thing that has come up. And it appears that just given the speed of business with the government versus that, you want the government to have a thoughtful process. They need to move with the speed of commerce as well. And so those two things kind of have combined to allow that to happen. But so if there's no comments on that, then I think what I would do is I'd want to take a vote on each section to say, just so that we have a very clear record, that I'd need a motion for section 13, no changes recommended, a motion and a second. And then the same on section 14, again, assuming that no one has any changes that they want, not trying to cut off debate, but trying to move the conversation forward.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we.
Actions on 13. I also read all my notes and couldn't quite remember why we even threw this on to rediscuss.
Okay. So that you're making a motion, no changes on 13?
No changes on 13.
I'll second that.
And Mr. Jones second that. Does that spur any discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I'm honestly trying to look back at the conversation here and make sure that we understand this. We're talking about the ones where we had discussion about moving the threshold to 50,000.
That's section 25.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think, yeah.
All right.
That's
I'm
expenditure.
just reading in the discussion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I was trying to say is
Yeah.
that all gets mashed together, and what I'm trying to do is make sure that we have a very clear record. Because as Mr. Berquist, I think they got smashed together, and so that's why 13, 14, and 25. So I want to pull them back apart, have very clear votes so that we have a clear record and there's no confusion when we're all not here to make that. So I have a motion for no changes to section 13 and a second from Mr. Jones. Any further discussion? Hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, can you call the roll?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes?
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Section 14, we're going to entertain a motion there for no changes if that's the will of the committee.
So moved.
Okay, Mr. Jones has made a motion for no changes to Section 14 emergency measures. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Mr. Meredith is seconding the motion. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, can you call the roll?
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
Mr. Berquist,
Yes?
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay, that motion is passed. Thank you. Okay, next is, let's see, Section 15, record and publication, and that was also went along with Section 16, price and mode of publication, and this has to deal with the city, the need to publish ordinances and resolutions and other things in the newspaper, and just the general modernization of that as a mode of disseminating information to the public. We did get some information from Mrs. Cresser on what the costs were and a little background from the practical administrative side of actually implementing this. You know, my read of the minutes that we went through with this is we talked about the idea of everybody, I think, is in favor of broad dissemination of that. I didn't discern anything clear out of that as to what changes we might make with this. So I, again, put it on here to bring it up. Is there something that somebody would recommend as a change to Section 15 or Section 16 of the charter as it relates to the mechanism of, you know, publication and the need to pay the cost for publication in the newspaper general circulation?
Well, Mr. Chairman, when this came out and was last modified, it was 89, and in the print circulation, the Sandusky Register then was probably about 40,000. Right now, the print circulation of Sandusky Register at a county of 80 is less than 17,000, and their rates are outrageous because I spend a lot on advertising. I think what we should possibly do is let the city manager look at alternative methods of getting that information out. Now, I do realize we have an aging demographics, and I'm still old school and read a hard newspaper every day. But as the demographics change, as media changes, as advertising changes, you're having less and less people to actually look at a newspaper. You know, I look at it, just make sure that everybody in the obits is at least older than me.
I'm laughing because I do that too.
Sometimes that's not the case.
Okay. You know, along those lines, was thinking about that too. I did notice in Section 16, it does have a proviso in there that whenever it appears to the city commission that the rates offered by the paper are too high, they have the right to go do an alternative means. So there is a price check in here. It may not have been utilized in the past, but it is wired in there. And so that mechanism is in there. That I think that's worth pointing out. I guess as far as like the disseminating it, I think, Mrs. Cresser, correct me here if I'm wrong, these are the technical requirements. That doesn't mean this is the only means of disseminating the information, but if you could just remind us of how you're making sure that people who don't read the newspaper, which is more and more the majority of the people, are going to be able to get and consume this information.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that is correct. All of our codified ordinances, in addition to being published in the newspaper, they are posted on our website prior to them being considered by the City Commission, and they are posted after they have been approved and executed.
Okay. And there's nothing in the charter that prevents us from continuing to kind of evolve that methodology of dissemination. And we're correct that this is just your technical requirements. You have to do this based on what the charter says, but then the rest of the world is open for other dissemination just from a communications perspective. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, I think when this originally was in place, that generally was the way that people could learn about something once it was passed. And when we did start having our own website and being able to publish things on the internet, we started doing it. We've gotten a lot better at it in the last 10 or 15 years, but the cost to us is always going to be there as long as we have our website. The newspaper is additional
Okay.
cost.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Tom Lamarca. I'm thinking about the society, the portion of our citizens that are basically illiterate when it comes to the computer, but as Mr. Berkowitz stated, they do pick up the newspaper. So I'll ask Ms. Kresser, if you put a little blob in the legal section of the register that says ordinance such and such has been proposed, see the city or go to the library, or to that effect to get further information, just so that they've been put on notice that something is happening legally within the city ordinances or tax base or whatever it may be. You follow my train of thought there?
Yeah. So
I do, and
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Mrs. Kresser.
that's okay. I was going to say that there are some communities, when I did research, that publish by title only, which would be exactly what Mr. Lamarca is speaking of, notifying people that a specific ordinance has changed or been passed and where to get the full text of it as a means of news advertising in the paper.
That would cut your costs by 90%.
I think you could do minimal advertising in the newspaper, drive them to the website. Even though the Sandusky Library is closed, their Wi-Fi is open, and you can hit it from their parking lot. The governor passed that right after they closed the library, so people can't say, well, we can't get access. My dad had a smartphone at 89.
Mr. Chairman, I would actually like to follow that up. There are still people that don't. And I think that the reason this is in here is because it's a way that all citizens can know what's out there. And I think times have changed to where we need to update it, but I think we need to be careful with the wording and kind of make sure that we get it right and make sure that there is a reliable places for those that have internet devices and those that don't. I think the newspaper idea is a good one, but perhaps with a time where that runs out. Even, I'm not exactly sure how to word it, but I will say I think we need to make sure we do a good job of wording this one. I would like to see easy to find on the internet, like its own tab on the home page, and definitely printed and brought, any city building and and the library. Just so that, people have come accustomed to this is how I know what's going on. And what we don't want is to create a system where people are confused about where to go. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure everybody knows where to go to get the information.
Yeah, so, and if I'm just reading the section 15, it does have it lays out a little bit what needs to be in that notice So it's all in the art form of being, how brief you can be in meeting these requirements, but there are some specific requirements in here that have to be met, especially with public improvements. Does have a price check provision in here. So I guess maybe one of the questions is should this, one of the things that we've really talked about is we see this, while it's a technical requirement that you maybe wouldn't change, is it sufficient to drive notification to the public, given the modern world? That's what I hear you saying, Mr. Whalen, is that you put it in the newspaper, but what, and we're all kind of saying that, how do we make sure that everybody gets it? Because that's really what this seeks to achieve. And so is there a need to modify this that would suggest that while, the newspaper is one mode, that the other modes have to be, in other words, there's a requirement that it be posted on the website. I don't know. But I'm just saying that's the other way to look at it. Because right now we're voluntarily doing that. It's in the city's interest to get that information out there, but it's not a requirement. They could get by with just putting it. In other words, if you wanted to hide the ball, maybe one of the things you could do is just put it in the paper. We did what we were supposed to do. That could happen. Now, I'm not saying that would happen. We have a responsive government, but that's kind of a danger there that if you're looking at a constitution, you might want to consider.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Jade Castile. I like the idea of minimal advertising in the paper with a kind of direction to where they can find the full text on the website, and maybe even having some hard copies available at the city building or somewhere for those individuals who do still want that and are not tech savvy or even just learn it on the internet at all.
Yeah, I wonder if you put in the notice and then you put the link or the address to where you could go get it, in other words, here's it is, and here's a link where you can get everything, and then the library ID and stuff like that, that's kind of where it's at. I wonder if that's something that could be considered.
Mr. Chairman, this is Kurt.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. This to me is like, we've had a lot of discussion about this, and in today's world, it is accessible anywhere, but I do feel it does need to be down at the library, here at the city building. A lot of folks need to go get it, pick it up, read it if they feel so inclined, and it has to be available. Mm-hmm. So it almost just seems to me like it's an easy enough thing to fix. It's just how you're going to word it, which is beyond me.
Or me.
Well, I think the other purpose of this is because this is every ordinance of a general or permanent nature, you need to inform the citizens of the rules, right, that they're living under in the city, and so that's a big part of it as well. So what say you? Do we need to are we saying that we need to add to this to make sure that we have greater circulation? Do we, that's why when I read the minutes before, we're kind of hovering over this idea of broad dissemination that utilizes modern technology, but also recognizes that the entirety of the populace hasn't kind of moved to that yet. So you kind of need the old school stuff along with the new school. If I look at this, the thing that may be lacking in here is any reference to the new school methodology. And I don't know, Mrs. Kresser, when you did your research, did you come across any other cities that have dealt with that particular issue about how to harness technology or require that technology be utilized as part of the publication process?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So I'm looking back through some of the notes that I took when I contacted some of the other municipalities. Some of them are by summary. Some of them are through their city's legislative bulletins or publications, those may be print and media or online as well. There's some that specifically name public places, such as libraries, fire stations, city halls, and like a 7-day posting or a specific amount of time that those are posted. There's a couple that say that they are posted in public places as determined by the city council or the city commission. So yeah, I guess they do vary slightly. The ones that don't require newspaper advertising have to say where they are physically posted.
That's easy enough to do.
Yeah, so.
In lieu of, yeah.
Right, so as we look at this, like section 15 tells you what you have to talk about, and section 16 talks about the how. And so that's really what we've been talking about is the how. And so really it's it calls out newspaper publication. And I read that to say two things that are important. It adopts newspaper because at the time this was written, that was the internet, if you will. That's where people got their information. And then it also calls out, shall be made but once and in one newspaper. Because that's predictability. Where do you go? You can go there to get that information. Now fast forward to today, the city has the ability to publish the document on their own website, and that can be the official site. And then we could add the provision to that says that in order to ensure full dissemination, they will also provide hard copies to be made available at the library, some of the other things that people have said, and to provide notice of the availability in the paper, which I think would take us through everything that we talked about, right? So I'll repeat that again, is that maybe what we're saying is that publication can mean on the city's website, okay? And that in addition to that, hard copies are made available at places of general public circulation, including the city, the city building and the public library, and that the city would publish the availability of each of those by subject matter in the newspaper of general circulation.
Mr. Chairman, the city also has a lot of other buildings where you could put
Fair enough.
something together that says, here it is. I mean,
Fair enough.
it's just not just here and there.
No, but I'm saying I could broaden that language to say, I'm trying to frame the discussion to kind of get us down to like, what are we really saying? And I think, and I'm not saying this is a motion or even a recommendation, I'm just trying to say, what have we really said? I think what we said is use modern means of publication that will cover most of the population, will be able to do it, put it in a single place where people know they can go to the city's website to see that, full stop. Then to address the issue that maybe not everybody is technically savvy, that they can go and would do that, you have to have an alternative means of publication, which would be to make it available at designated city buildings and at the public library, full stop, that's where you go to get it. And then the third thing, to cut down on the publication costs, is say that the city would then say, we passed this ordinance and a copy is available, a hard copy is available here, and you can also get it on the city's website. I think that kind of covers the full spectrum of what we've said. Whether or not we want to do that or not is another issue, but so I'll stop there and ask for comments or additions or subtractions or that's crazy, that's not what we said kind of comments. Yes, Mr. Meredith.
Mr. Chairman, I think you summarized it well, and I think the key word is publication, modern publication, avenues, and how you stated it was spot on. So I would recommend we move in that direction.
Okay. Others?
Mr. Chairman, this is David Mack.
Yes.
And I agree with the comment that was just made. I think that covers kind of all the the items that were brought up. Maybe one item to potentially throw out for consideration is instead of designating a specific location, I think the term you brought up was city buildings. I kind of like that general comment. That way, if anything changes down the road, it kind of gives flexibility for when things are passed that, it can be determined at that time where the location is. So all in all, I think the recommendation was said well.
Okay, thank you. Others?
This is more a question than a comment. We don't really need to touch 15 then, right? We're really looking at modifying 16.
That's the way I'm looking at it, yeah. The what to say is in
Right.
15, I don't think we have
We
an
don't need to
issue with that.
change
It's
that.
how you say it and where.
Then I'd like to make a motion that we keep section 15 as is and move that to the don't amend pile.
Okay, is there a second on that? This is section 15.
second
We have a second by Mr. Kresser. Okay, so any discussion on that? So essentially that what we're saying is what we need to say and what we need to publish is fine. That's the import of that motion. Any comments on that? If not, Mrs. Kresser, can you call the roll on that motion to leave section 15 of the charter unchanged?
Mr. Bergquist,
Yes?
Ms. Castile,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Kresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sartino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes. So that takes us to, thank you for that, Mr. Jones. That was good to clean that up. So that takes us to section 16 and how the information is disseminated. And we were discussing at that time, kind of the summary that I had put out there that I think is an amalgamation of what everybody said, which is publish on the city website with a link. Hard copies available at city buildings and public library, and then an announcement by title and subject matter with where the availability was as another form of notice that would substantially, as someone said, cut 90% or better down in the newspaper. And so that's kind of what we were discussing. And so I open the floor back up to that discussion.
Instead of saying library, I believe it was Mr. Mack that made the comment that flexibility is good. Can we say any building that serves a public interest, for example?
Okay.
Library being one. One that popped into my head was like the senior center would be another one that would be, I think that they would be well served to have a publication there. But we don't necessarily need to go through and list.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yep.
Question for Mr. Jones. Do you mean any or all?
Any.
You know what I mean? The
Yes.
idea of any could create confusion. Well, where is it? Or are you saying all public buildings? And then does that become too burdensome or?
Well,
Adding to that, you don't want to open it up to where someone from the city is going to be responsible for running a print hard copy to all of the different
Yeah.
city buildings, because then we're just
That's
back
where
to
I'm at with
going
it. I like the library, city hall, and the fire station.
But so I think that's why you have the last section in there, that your notice in the paper designates where it is.
Yeah.
And so it marries together what everybody's saying. You can pick from a lot of different places, but you do have to put the topic and the subject matter and say it is available at the public library, for example, or at the senior center, or what have you, and at the water plant or the city building or the fire station or whatever it is.
Who's going to go to the water plant picking?
Well, I'm just picking out city buildings off the top of my head.
I mean,
The greenhouse, how about
I
that?
mean,
The greenhouse.
you throw
the
out a
greenhouse.
couple, 2 or 3 places they can go. I mean, they're going to go. They'll
Yeah,
get
yeah,
used
no,
to it,
but
you
my
know?
point is you can pick from them, but you have to declare so that you're not required to put it everywhere.
And I think that accomplishes the purpose, and not to overbeat this, but how many characters are we gonna save then? If we're paying by character and we're listing all of the
Yeah.
all of the locations, might it be easier to designate a few?
Can,
Well, I think if you clarify it where public already has access. I don't think the public has access to the water treatment plant.
Yeah, yeah.
Mr. Chair,
So why put something there?
Mr. Chairman,
You're out of here. Well, wait a minute. Well, let's ask Mrs. Cresser, your office would have to kind of take care of this. What would you say in those terms of where you would put it? Or just, I'm curious as to your feeling of this overall perspective on how we might move forward to modernize this a bit.
can I ask a clarifying question before we move forward? I'm sorry, this is Jade. Is it not possible to have broad general language in the charter, and then like you were I think this is what you were saying, I just wanted to make sure I was clear, to have this general language in the charter so that we don't pigeonhole ourselves into a location, and then we're specific about that location with each announcement in the paper and publications on the internet? Is that not an option?
No, that's it. What I think would happen would be you can just list with general, you want to describe it in broad terms, but then you would end up routinizing where it is.
And being consistent.
You'd come up with this is where it's going to be and you'd put it in there and you just keep it
keep
there.
it
But if, for
consistent.
instance, the public library went away, then you don't have like, oh my God.
You have
now
to
there's
go
no
back and
public
change the
library.
charter to say now it's at
We
this
say something to
location.
the effect of public spaces as the city commission deems.
Yeah.
Appropriate.
I like that language.
Yes, so broad language and then be specific in your publications.
Okay. Okay. Any more comments on that? Mrs. Cresser, I didn't hear you kind of weigh in on that. So I do want to hear from you from a practical perspective so that we don't get carried away with our own problem solving here.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So if this commission wants to, or committee wants to make any change to this, I would say that it should be left up to public locations as determined by the city commission and on our city website. That way, if the means is ever to change or the locations are ever to change, that can be done by a simple motion of the city commission
Yep.
and not another charter change.
Okay.
Those are my thoughts.
All right. That's kind of, I think that language works well in terms of it. There's a lot of flexibility, but there's some certainty along the way that can be flexible. Okay. Any other comments on that? So let me go back and kind of restate where I think we're at right now, and then maybe we'd get a motion on it, which is that this is section 16, price and mode of publication, is that the city would be authorized to publish as to meet the publication requirement by putting these on their website, that would be determined to be published, and then would additionally make hard copies available at public locations as determined by the city commission. And then that would be announced in the newspaper as well. Is that part, Kelly, part of what you were thinking as well? That you put like this ordinance was passed and it's available at the library and at the city building?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically 3 things: the internet, public spaces as determined by the city commission, and then a abbreviated publication in the newspaper letting the general public know where it's at. So those are the 3 attributes that we just boiled it out to. So I'll stop there, see if there's any more comments, and if not, if somebody would make a motion and then we can see if everyone's agreeable to that.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to accept the language you just presented to the commission.
Okay, is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, Jeff Berquist, I'll second that.
Okay, have a motion and a second. Any further discussion on section 16, price and mode of publication, and the suggested motion? Hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, can you call the roll?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes?
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. LaMarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sartino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes. Okay, thanks. Next are section 17 and section 18. This is, these sections have to do with the appointment of the law director and the appointment of the finance director, and these were amended back in 2015. Those positions formally reported directly to the city commission, and in 2015, when they changed the charter, those positions then began to report to the city manager. The city manager appoints them with the approval of the city commission. But then once appointed, they become the city manager's employee, and they serve at his or her pleasure. So that, we had some discussion around that. And so I'll open the floor back up. And those, I guess to Mr. Berquist, I wanted to go back to this, like, how do these get on here? These were things that we want to make sure that where there was some discussion, that we gave them the ability to be fully discussed, so that no one would feel like we just bumped over something. So with that, I'll open the floor up for discussion on section 17 and section 18, because I think they handle the exact same kind of perspective.
My thoughts were on that, and during the discussion is now I look at the federal government where we have 3 tiers, you know, where Congress basically controls the purse strings, you know, and then you have the judicial system, and then you have the president. Or kind of the way I look at it here, we don't really have those 3 tiers. We have a tier that pyramids down. And I think our current city manager and the legal and everything are doing a great job. That doesn't mean down the road we couldn't have information that may not get up to the right sources because it gets filtered, in that the law director and the financial director, according to the bylaws, work at the pleasure of the city manager. You know, that language in there is what bothers me, at the pleasure of. So if I worked for a boss, and I haven't worked for a boss for 40 years, but I used to, you never wanted to bring him bad news because you worked at his pleasure. You know? And then he never wanted to get that bad news because he knew he had to take it somewhere else. So not that it's happening now, but we only review this every 5 years. So I think we really need to look at, and I wasn't on it 5 years ago, what was their thoughts 5 years ago in making the 2 other departments answer only to one? And I'm asking this more for clarification on my own self.
Yeah, I think Mr. Whalen, you served. Yeah,
Yes, I was on that one, and the idea was, I view it more as a two at the top. It's not 3, you know, levels of checks and balances, but you got 2. You got the elected city commission, and you got the city manager. And it used to be that the law director and the finance director worked like the manager at the pleasure of the commission rather than the manager. But the manager is the one that is the executive in charge of making things happen. and moving things forward. And so for that person to not have necessarily the communication he needed from a law director or a finance director can create more problems than having too much, in our opinion, on the last one. Because, you know, the checks over the city manager abusing his power is that he works at the pleasure of the commission, and the commission can remove him. So,
Yeah, it's
I
like
mean-
the attorney general, more than, right? You know, the president appoints the attorney general and serves at his, I think that's more of than the checks and balance, where the commission is the legislative branch and the city manager is the executive that implements those legislation.
Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, after I think it was was this our first meeting or second meeting? I received unsolicited contact from a city business owner they've operated their business for many, many years in downtown Sandusky and have had to work through different city managers, commissions, et cetera. And this individual felt very strongly that this current setup of this current structure with the law director and the finance director reporting to this manager has made their life a lot easier. They feel like there's more open communication, and overall, this individual asked that really to think long and hard about it and keep it the way it is set up. So there's been some positive feedback from that first discussion we had around this.
Yeah, I'm curious, that's good feedback. Anybody else, please offer their feedback as well. But Mr. Whalen, in terms of Mr. Berquist, when you guys talked about it before, what was the outlet for, I think what you're getting at, if there's a dispute, there could be a dispute about the legality of something you're doing or the wisdom of a financial expenditure. There's legalities that go into that. What's the outlet for the whistleblowing? I mean, did you guys talk about that? I think that's kind of the issue. What's the outlet for that? If I have to go to my boss, whereas before I had a check where my boss was his boss. So it's a little bit different. Did you guys discuss that, or can you give us any further context on that point?
I mean, it was 5 years ago. I don't remember the details of it. I just think that ultimately we thought that the city manager is going to have to be held accountable by the commission.
Right.
And so
that's where the buck stops, so to speak.
And if you're gonna have the buck stop there, then you want to make sure that he is able to have, control of what he needs to do to make it happen.
And there is the audit function, auditors, external, state that comes in for the finance director. Then that's another level of oversight there. And then I think with the law director, as I'm thinking through it, they have their own independent ethical obligation as an attorney to kind of not, they have to blow the whistle if something is going on. And they're professional people that I think would need to bring that forward. And I think in a corporate structure, a lot of times you are working for the CEO or the president of the company, and that tension is there. So it isn't unusual, I guess, is my point. So anybody else on things that they've heard from the community, input or concerns about the setup as it exists today? From a structural perspective, I mean, you were careful to say it isn't who's in office right now. It's as a structure. When we put new people in there, will it still work? Would it still work? Okay, hearing none, then we need to kind of move forward either with a recommendation to change or a recommendation, motion to change and outline those, the parameters of the change, or a motion to not change these provisions. And we would again take them one at a time just for clarity of the record. So section 17, law director and assistants, is there anybody that wants to make a motion on that section?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we do not make a change to section 17.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second that.
There's a second by Mr. Whalen. Any further discussion? Concerns, comments?
Mr. Chairman, through you,
Yes.
I think, your point is good, and I think, you know, thinking back to it the last time, that is the one worry that you have. Well, who do you want these guys to report to? But ultimately, we decided then that things are going to function better, and you're still going to have a check if they're reporting to the manager. If somebody had some language or some thoughts on how you could put a little bit more of, you know, freedom for the whistleblowing, I don't think that would be a bad thing, but I don't have any to recommend.
The city commission does have the executive session where they can utilize that in order to talk to individuals, and if they feel like that's going on, they do have that as an added, you know, and we can come up with a lot of constructs that would help facilitate that. I think the professional kind of responsibilities of the individuals that would serve as a law director or a finance director are pretty strong. I mean, or they wouldn't be there long, so, but it could happen. Any more comments?
Mr. Chairman, Tom Lamarca. My only concern is, just as Mr. Whalen spoke, where does the finance director or the law director go if they see an issue within that three-way balance and working at the pleasure of the city manager? And I'm not speaking in specifically directed to anyone, but looking at the future.
Yeah.
I mean, who do they go to? I mean, you know, if they're, I don't see where there's a check and balance on that. I mean, where does someone go?
So I mean, I can say that what my experience would tell me is that when that starts to happen, so the circumstance that we'd be talking about is where the executive of the city wants to go down a certain road, okay, and the law director, the finance director is advising against that for a host of reasons. And typically what you hope happens is that everybody takes a step back and says, okay, how can we do this to make sure that everybody's on the same page? But when it doesn't, then they would have to, you know, put it in writing and say, you shouldn't be doing this. I recommend against this.
Is now exiting.
And then if that doesn't work, then you're into the situation where they're going to have to go, they're going to have the professional integrity to go to the city commission. And whenever you're relying on the personal integrity of people, there's some frailty in the system. Not that people don't try to do that, but sometimes it takes more courage than people can summon. So I think that's legitimate to consider, but there's I personally would say there's lots of professional pressure to do that may be an adequate safeguard. My opinion would be an adequate safeguard, but you know, I hear the point. That's what I would offer.
So you're saying, as a past law director, that you would write your complaint to your city manager, who's your boss, and hand him or her a letter and say, I got issues with you on this criteria?
What I'm saying is, when I was the city law director, I did report to the city commission, but at that time, still in the back and forth of working with someone professionally, the first step in that process isn't to go run to the city commission and say, hey, they're doing something wrong. It's to go to them and outline, it would be about an issue, like, here's why I think what you're doing would expose us to liability, let's say in the legal perspective. Expose us to liability, or it doesn't comport with the statute or whatever, and kind of lay that out for them and say, as a result of this, my recommendation is that you not do this, or that you take an alternative course. That's the first step in that process, to put the person on notice of that in a formal way. And then you have the executive session and the other things that you could go to the city commission about. But I guess what I'm saying is, I think that happens whether they report to the city commission or they report to the city manager, because they're working with them every day. I think the same process would play itself out, I guess, is the moral of the story.
Yeah.
But that's just my one guy's opinion. But I don't know, others weigh in.
This is Jade Castile. I just needed another clarifying question. I guess I don't understand if it's the same three players, whether they're reporting to the city manager or the commission, how that would be different. if there was an issue within the administration between all three.
What do you mean in terms of why it's better?
Yes, yes, because he was saying you said you used to report to the commission, and they're now reporting to the city manager, but I thought Tom was pointing out he said if there was a problem within this triangle. So it's the same three players, whether they're reporting to the manager or the commission, and I guess that's why I was trying to get clarification from Tom about what he thought would be the pro of having them report to the commission if it's the triangle that's the problem.
Yeah, okay,
I've still got questions on it, and I know that Mr. Kresser and Mr. Whalen were on that change going from the finance director and the law director reporting to the commission because there were too many people telling everyone which direction to go. And I understand the point of trying to make one person, I guess, in charge, but it's like the tail wagging the dog a little bit. Manager is in charge of spending, but the manager is also in charge of the finance director. And so if the finance director or the city manager wants to pump $1 million into a pet project, the finance director's got to go along with that train of thought or resign.
well, I think, fair enough, but I think there's other little, like the finance director, there's lots of things that they have to sign off on, and so that's their check, like I won't sign that. And if they do sign it, then they're putting their professional reputation on the line, or like the city law director has to approve forms and contracts. And so there is a check there, but I don't think, and I'm with you on terms of if it's the three, and that's what I was kind of trying to get at. That's an issue amongst those three, who they report to. They're still going to have to work it out amongst those three before they go to the city commission. And I think part of the logic that I heard before was that when the three report to the city commission, it gives an opportunity for the city commission then to say, well, what do you think, law director? And what do you think, Mr. Finance Director? And what do you think, manager? And the group over here that doesn't want to do what the manager does uses the other two as a kind of a veto tool of sorts. And I think that's I don't know if that was discussed, but I think that's a danger in that form of government as well. All these issues are completely legitimate, and we won't get a perfect solution.
Right.
So I don't know. So that's why we're debating it. But I think you make a legitimate point. I don't know. Did they discuss that? The kind of the impact on the commission itself to have three people reporting to them as it relates to where they go to get their information on a particular issue.
I mean, sort of, I guess would be the answer there. The idea was that was the problem. That was why we went to change it. Commissioner, you're keeping, if you're working for the commission, you're keeping 7 people happy. When you got 3 different equal players doing that, there can be a lot of kind of dissension in the ranks there. And when they both work for the commission, for the manager, and the manager has to answer to the commission.
Yeah, and so that you take the decision-making apparatus and bounce it up against the whistleblowing apparatus or checks and balance, trying to find that balance. And I think we talked about before, this has been going on for 5 years, and it's been good results so far. And so I think what we talked about is, has it been there long enough to see if that's the right balance?
I would add that I would hope, as a citizen in Sandusky, I would hope that the finance director and the law director are both completely available to everybody on the commission and are qualified and competent enough at their job that they're going to speak the truth of what they see. And if the manager is kind of trying to influence them into something that they disagree with, I would hope that there's ample time for them to share that with the commission, who ultimately do employ the manager.
Yeah, and like I said, they have a professional responsibility to do that, and there's things that they're gonna have to sign off along the way that give them the power to say, wait a minute, I'm not comfortable, I'm not gonna sign that, so. Okay, further, now, so just to go back and set, we had a motion to not change section 17, and then that led to this discussion. So is there any further discussion? All right. Hearing none, then we would call the roll on the motion to not change section 17 of the city charter. Mrs. Cresser, could you?
Berquist?
No, go ahead.
Yes.
Ms. Castile?
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra?
Yes.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Cresser?
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca?
Yes.
Mr. Mack?
Yes.
Mr. Meredith?
Yes.
Mr. Milky?
Yes.
Ms. Murray?
Yes.
Ms. Sortino?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That passes. Now, section 18, Finance Director. Do I have a motion on that?
I would make a motion that we keep section 18 as is.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Mr. Lamarca, second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, can you call the roll?
Mr. Berquist?
Yes.
Ms. Castile?
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra?
Yes.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Cresser?
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca?
Yes.
Mr. Mack?
Yes.
Mr. Meredith?
Yes.
Mr. Milky?
Yes.
Ms. Murray?
Yes.
Ms. Sortino?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel?
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes. Okay, so then that takes us to section 25, expenditures. We touched on this a little bit earlier. This is the provision of the charter that sets the limits when competitive bidding is necessary and when commission approval is necessary. Currently, both of those are at $10,000 as the threshold. And we've had a number of conversations about that, including the concept of indexing, the concept of taking it to where the state is. We looked at a variety of other places in terms of what their number was, their threshold number was. We had hovered around raising the threshold to 50,000, but not indexing it. I thought we were saying that we wanted to keep that local, but understood that the 50,000 was probably more in keeping with the modern pricing that was out there. And so I think that was the state that we left off at. And so I'll open the floor up for discussion on section 25 expenditures.
Trying to find it in the notes here, and I'm not coming across it. It seemed like we had two different numbers, or there was two separate things that we were talking about here, and we had two different numbers for it.
Yeah, one was competitive bidding.
The competitive
When do you need to
bidding,
get a competitive bid? That's one. And the second one is when do you need commission approval? And so what they said, and my apologies, I should have been more clear on that. The city staff said, we could live with those if they were different. In other words, you don't have to get a competitive bid unless it's over 50, but if it's over 25, the city commission still got to approve it. They could live with that, is what they said, but it would obviously make it a little easier to have one number as you're shooting. And I'm just referencing what they said. I'm not adopting that, but that's what they said. And then the other thing that's in there is they would have competitive quotations for anything over $1,000. So they offered that as another check, right? So you don't have to do competitive bid, but you're still doing competitive quotations. And what the information we got on that was that the competitive bid is often very time consuming and sometimes given the low number, the places that you're going to buy it from we're giving them a headache with having us respond to a competitive bid package as opposed to just being able to do a quotation. So that, I think, and thank you for bringing that up, I think that's what we talked about. So just a quick summary, competitive bidding threshold and approval by the city commission threshold. So let's talk about the competitive bidding threshold as an item of itself, just to organize our conversation. And so that's at $10,000 right now. The recommendation, I think, from the city staff was $50,000 was more appropriate. And we also, as I said, talked about the idea of indexing, which I think we kind of built a consensus that maybe indexing would be a step too far. So let me stop there and let's talk about competitive bidding. What's the right threshold first, and do we want to change that? And if we do, what's the right threshold?
Well, looking back at my notes, not only was the recommendation $50,000, but there was also a cost factor and a time factor.
Yep.
And how long it takes to do this. And since this hasn't been changed in 20 years, $10,000, you could have bought a house. You know.
Yeah.
How you get a used Yugo? So my recommendation would be that we would entertain the thing of taking that up to $50,000, not only from a cost standpoint, but from a time frame standpoint.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on the competitive bidding side of it?
Agree with that.
I'd agree.
I agree.
I agree as well.
Okay. Anybody feel that 50,000 is too high? Okay, hearing no one. Anyone feel strongly that we should index that so that we don't have to revisit it?
I don't believe we should index it.
Okay. I think that's kind of what we said, but make sure that, okay. So if we put the competitive bid at 50,000, then the other threshold that we talked about was when the city commission needs to approve in advance, approve the expenditure. That's also at 10. And so, as I said, the staff said, having them both at 50 allows for ease of administration. But if you wanted a little lower threshold for when city commission approval would be, they could learn to manage that, is basically what they said. So on city commission approval threshold, it's at 10,000. Any comments from the committee on where we should go with that? Is it similar to competitive bidding, or how do you guys think about it?
Similar.
I'd say similar. I'd go with the 50,000.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody think 50,000 is too high? And this is for city commission approval threshold. No, hearing none. Okay. Okay. So with that, then if we wanted to make that change, I think we would need to make the motion to that we would recommend putting a change in the city charter to amend section 25 expenditures so that the competitive bidding threshold was 50,000 and the city and this approval of the expenditure by the city commission would also be moved to 50,000. So if someone would want to make that motion, then we can call the quote, then we can.
Mr. Chairman, I'd make the motion, we change both those numbers to $50,000.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second that. Got it.
Okay, Mr. Berquist made the motion, Mr. Cresser seconded it. And that's to raise the competitive bidding threshold to 50,000 and the city commission approval to 50,000. Any further comments, questions, concerns? Okay, hearing none. Mrs. Cresser, will you call the roll on the motion?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes.
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. LaMarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milkey,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
I think-
is muted. Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Ms. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay. That motion is passed. Next is civil service, section 27. And this primarily deals with the process for selecting the chief of police and the fire chief. And the discussion that we had was, there were a couple of things, I think primarily, but others please weigh in, is the rank that you had to achieve in order to be able to apply, and whether or not, given the changes in departments over time and the different naming conventions that each department uses, should we have a more, a standard that was more general, or equivalent type of an approach. And then that was one issue. To broaden the pool, the fire chief and the police chief felt that would help broaden the pool to give more qualified candidates an opportunity. And then the years of experience, and how somebody could have the years of experience but go away and be out of, not do it for a year, and now all of a sudden they're ineligible. And I think that what had been suggested on that, at the end of that discussion, I think Mr. Whalen suggested 10 out of the last 12 years as a way to address that issue. It gets at, I think Mr. Lamarca brought up that 10 years is an important marker of experience, and then 10 out of 12 years gives you a little bit of latitude for a transition where you move from one department maybe to another or something like that and come back. So I think that's where, those were the two major issues that we discussed on that. And so I just say that to kind of set it up and open up the floor for discussion about what we might want to do with Section 27.
Mr. Chairman, it's Trevor.
Yes.
I just wanted to point out that we had also talked about moving in the police, it currently says lieutenant, to moving that down to sergeant or the equivalent or higher. And for, I'm sorry, that's for police. And for firefighter, moving that down to lieutenant or the equivalent or higher.
Okay, thank you. All right, so police, the minimum rank would be sergeant or equivalent, and for fire, the minimum rank would be lieutenant or equivalent. Ten out of the last 12 years. Okay, thank you, Mr. Haberger. Comments, questions?
I do like the fact that it's 10 out of 12 years, just in case. I mean, we could.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
This is Chief Wilcox.
Yes.
I have to make an amendment to that. I thought I was clear last time we spoke about it. That was for any promoted position within the department. That includes the fire marshal office.
For the within lieutenant rank, you mean?
No, fire marshal, lieutenant, captain rank can all test for the chief position.
Okay, so add the designation of fire marshal?
Yes.
Okay. All right, sorry, Mr. Burquest, go ahead.
That's quite all right. I'm glad for clarity. That we say, 10 out of the last 12 years, to reposition something. With Mr. Wilcox stepping down, it could hopefully not happen, but it could be that in a year, we hire somebody that doesn't work out or chooses not to stay in beautiful Sandusky, why wouldn't they? That we might have to go back to Mr. Wilcox and say, hey, you want to come play back in this party again? Under current charters, we couldn't bring him back, even though he would certainly have all the experience.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that was, I think, Mr. Whalen kind of brought a similar situation up, and that the 10 out of 12 seem to address that. So others that want to comment on Section 27 civil service, or anything that that I missed in my summary of kind of where we were at that needs to get on the table for discussion?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, we had a nice discussion with both Chief Orzak and Chief Wilcox, and I'm not sure of all the rankings with each department, but whatever they recommended as far as a certain rank that you need to achieve before you can apply, I think that's they better know that than I do, and I would have to agree with what they were saying. The years of experience obviously is a big thing. I mean, somebody has to put their time in, and if they're putting their time in, they're reaching the ranks that they recommend, to be able to apply for the chief's position is good. I mean, that was a good discussion we had with them that night. So what they recommend and what we're recommending, the 12 out of 10 years or 10 out of 12 years, however it works, I'm good with that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Others want to weigh in? Okay. Then in order for us to move forward on this, if we wanted to move forward with the change that we'd recommend to the city commission, what I'm hearing is that we would modify the section 27 to have the rank for police to be sergeant or equivalent, and for fire, lieutenant, captain, fire marshal or equivalent, and with 10 out of 12 years of service, and that would be the recommended modification. And so if we want to entertain that, I'll need somebody to make a motion and then a second, and then we can see where we're at.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask just one question?
Absolutely.
I mean, a lot of these things, the wording is what is the big thing. I mean, we all kind of agree on a lot of things. Does Trevor, our law director, does he come up and word these out properly?
So here, I think I asked the same question before we came. So I think that it's been handled two different ways in the past. Remember, what we're doing is we're not putting things on the ballot. What we're doing is we're saying as a committee of citizens of the community who've gotten the input from our constituents and people in the community, the city commission, our job is to look at the charter and then to submit a recommendation to the city commission to consider putting these things on a ballot for change. So I think ours would come in, I think the one time they handled it, it comes in the form of a letter. A report out from this group to the city commission that doesn't have technical language, it has descriptive language that captures what we're saying our recommendation is. So you think of it in more of as a recommendation than as an ordinance or as ballot language. And so I think I'll just pause here and say the process that I think we should, that I'm driving towards here a little bit as we get this, take the notes. The last thing that we'll do is we'll circulate a letter that has this spelled out and allow everyone to look at that and then come in and then we'll sign that and say, yes, this is our recommendation. So that's how the process would conclude.
That sounds good to me because I really wouldn't want my paragraphs to be filled out and put in here, so.
And so we will do that, so does that answer your question?
Yeah, I understand.
Okay, and then if we want to have a motion on this civil service, then we can talk process a little bit after that because we're right at the 7 o'clock hour. So anybody want to make a motion on the civil service changes that we just discussed?
All right, Mr. Chairman, Tom Lamarca, I'll make a motion to make the changes as we've discussed. 10 out of 12 active years for police and or fire. Qualifications being the fire marshal, lieutenant, shift commander, et cetera, police side, sergeant or better. Does that encapsulate it?
I think it does.
I'll second that.
Okay, Mr. Jones has seconded. Mrs. Cresser, will you call the roll? Right, I'm sorry, let me stop. Any further questions, comments? Hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, will you call the roll?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes.
Ms. Castile,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sartino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So as I said, it's about 5 after 7 right now. The 3 sections that we have left, were put on because we had some discussion. They're not as meaty as these other ones were. Some are vestiges of the past and some are no longer enforceable, but the issue was to kind of just keep them in there in case they did become. So I think if unless Mrs. Cresser tells me otherwise, I think we could probably plow through those and get those done the next 10 or 15 minutes. And then what that would set us up for is, as I mentioned to Mr. Cresser, what we would do is then take away the information and what we voted on, put it in a letter format, circulate it to the group, and then our meeting on the 15th, we could come in and discuss it, make sure that it says what everybody thinks it should say, give a chance for input ahead of time. Then we could have, we could use it as a time to sign it and then to adjourn the committee having completed its task. And so if everybody's amenable to that, I think we could plow through these next 2 or 3 here and finish that part of it. Is that acceptable to everybody?
Yes.
What's that?
Get the plow going.
All right. So the next section then is section 37, sewer, water, and gas connections. And we talked about this before. This is where if you don't get it done while they're doing the work, you need the consent of the city commissioners to go in and basically kind of get permission to do a project. Result, with excavation for sewer, water, and gas. We talked a little bit about that. We got some input from Aaron Klein and Trevor and Mr. Hayberger. And basically they said they work with the citizens on this quite regularly and that there is the outlet, if something were to come up, the majority of the city commission could authorize it. So we did talk about that. So I wanted to raise that issue here. I got put on the list of further discussion. And so I'm opening the floor up. Does anyone want to have further discussion on this or have a motion in mind for some modification of this provision?
I'm just going to ask Mr. Whalen, I mean, you brought this up the first time around. When we had that discussion with Mr. Klein, are you good with?
Yeah, I didn't plan to. I was going to let this go through kind of quickly and then make a motion to keep as is.
All right, we'll take the motion. We got a motion to keep as is from Mr. Whalen.
I'll second that.
Mr. Cresser seconds it. Any discussion? Hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, will you call the roll?
Mr. Berquist?
Yes.
Ms. Castillo?
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra?
Yes.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Cresser?
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca?
Yes.
Mr. Mack?
Yes.
Mr. Meredith?
Yes.
Mr. Milky?
Yes.
Ms. Murray?
Yes.
Ms. Sartino?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel?
Yes.
Okay, that motion is passed. Next is section 76, audit and appraisal, and I think this one came back simply because we needed to have additional information. This has a reference in here to the sinking fund trustees. And this function of audit and appraisal is now done by the finance department of the city, so it's getting done. But the question was, well, what happened to the sinking fund trustees? And Mrs. Cresser actually found the vote from 1977 where that they acknowledged in that vote that the sinking fund trustee trustees were not functioning or being utilized, and so they repealed it at that time. And I think it's, my read of it is it's one of those situations where, is the juice worth the squeeze in terms of trying to get it out of the other part of the thing for, because the real part of section 76 audit and appraisal is that an audit and appraisal is being done. So it's kind of an antiquated reference that doesn't have a lot of impact, but if we wanted to clean it up, then that would be that we would remove the reference to the sinking fund trustees, and it's really up to us to decide whether or not that's something that we would want to put on the ballot or recommend being put on the ballot. So any discussion? Any motions?
Motion to keep as is.
Okay, second?
Second.
Mr. Whalen made the motion and Mr. Jones seconded it for no changes. Any further discussion? Hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, can you call the roll?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes.
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes. And then last but not least, the residency requirement. And we had some information from Mr. Hayberger with respect to the constitutionality of the residency requirements and cases that have come down from the Supreme Court on the enforceability of this particular provision. And we had a good discussion on it, and I think one of the principles that was put out there is that the law changes over time, and so does it make sense to just allow this to remain in the charter for purposes of that if the law were to change, then we would have a provision in there to require residency, even though at the current time it's not enforceable, based on the current state of the law. So I think that boils into is residency an important requirement, something that we want to encourage and that we would enforce if the constitutional law and the Supreme Court allowed us to do it? Or is it something that we say, no, they made the ruling and then, so we might as well just pull it out? So that's why it's back on here, because we had that discussion, we need, I think, a roll call vote on that. So I'll open the floor up. Any comments, questions?
Mr. Chairman, my recommendation is leave it as is.
Okay, is that a motion?
Yes.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it, Jade.
Second. Yeah, Ms. Castillo seconded it. Mr. Berquist made the motion, Ms. Castillo seconded it. Any further discussion? Hearing none, Mrs. Cresser, can you call the roll?
Mr. Berquist,
Yes.
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
Mrs. Guerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Mr. Cresser,
Yes.
Mr. Lamarca, Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Meredith,
Yes.
Mr. Milky,
Yes.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Ms. Sortino,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mrs. Yandel,
Yes.
Okay, that motion is passed. Okay, that takes us to the end of section 5B of the agenda. So section 6 is old business. Is there any old business? None, and no new business? No new business. The next meeting is set for July 15th, 2020 at 5 p.m. As I mentioned, I think what we'll do is we'll take the information and the vote of what we just came down to as our recommendations. We'll put that in a letter form as a recommendation to the City Commission. We'll circulate that in advance of the next meeting. I would ask that we'll try to get that out a few days in advance, and then everybody can read it. And if you have questions, send those in so that when we come here, we've got a near final, if not hopefully final recommendation that we can all sign off on. So if that process is acceptable, we'll have a little bit of homework to do and we'll circulate that to everybody. And then I'll ask one more time, any comments or questions? And if there aren't any further, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor, signify by saying